What if you were told your whole life that the ocean was empty, only to find out it was waiting for you to learn how to swim before it showed you its teeth? You look up every day. You see the blue, the clouds, the sun. You call it the sky. You assume it's a space, an emptiness. But that is the first and last mistake. The sky is not a space. It's a place. And it has been watching us learn to fly for 100 years, with an ancient, terrifying patience. In the next few moments, you're not going to hear a story. You're going to be shown a memory of the day the sky got tired of waiting. And the perceived safety of that blue ceiling above you will be permanently and irrevocably shattered. It all begins with an assumption. You assume the sky is a constant, a vast, empty canvas governed by rules you understand. For Roman Dre, sitting in the hushed dark of air traffic control, this assumption was the bedrock of his reality. The rhythmic blips on the screen, the calm, professional voices crackling through the headset. They were a liturgy. A predictable, orderly world. Then came the first voice that was just off. Flight 302, a heavy Boeing on its way to Dallas. The pilot, a veteran of 20 years, reported turbulence. But it wasn't the word he used, it was the hesitation behind it. A slight tremor in his voice, a pause that was a fraction too long. He called it glassy air, an empty, meaningless phrase, yet it hung in the sterile environment of the control room like a ghost. Roman logged it, his fingers moving on autopilot. Just an odd report, an anomaly. You already are in a world that is about to break. You just don't know it yet. But that's only the surface. 1 report is an anomaly. 2 is a coincidence. 3 is a pattern. Within 40 minutes, 4 more aircraft, all flying above 30,000 feet but separated by hundreds of miles, reported the same phenomenon. Glassy air. A sudden bizarre pressure. Like flying through jelly. These weren't the standard terms. This wasn't in the manual. Roman and his colleagues checked the weather systems. The sky was clear. No storms, no jet stream anomalies, nothing. Yet, the pilots' reports painted a picture of an inner world in turmoil, their instruments telling them one thing, their senses screaming another. The map on the main screen, once a symbol of order, started to look like a board game where an unseen player was placing pieces at will. The comfortable state of routine was dissolving, replaced by a creeping, formless anxiety. The selection of a logical explanation was becoming difficult. Here's what changes everything. The reports began to get physical. A pilot on a transatlantic flight, his voice tight with controlled panic, spoke of a shimmer outside his cockpit window, a distortion that made the stars themselves seem to warp and bend. Another, on a cross-country red-eye, reported a strange, high-pitched hum that wasn't coming from his engines. His consciousness was registering something impossible, a sensory input that his brain had no file for. This wasn't just about uncomfortable rides anymore. The calls escalated. 1 plane reported its outer temperature gauge fluctuating wildly, dropping to impossible sub-zero temperatures, and then spiking in a matter of seconds. They were flying through something that wasn't just empty space, wasn't just weather, it was an environment, a hostile one. The feeling is the key, and the feeling was that the sky itself was becoming aware. Now go deeper. Roman felt it in his gut, a cold knot of dread. He started to ignore the official weather data, opening a separate private screen to map the incident locations himself. He wasn't just an observer. His imagination began to connect the dots, to feel the shape of this thing. He saw that the incidents weren't random. They occurred in specific high-altitude corridors, almost like invisible rivers in the sky. It was as if something was moving up there, something vast and unseen, its passage disrupting the fabric of the atmosphere. He saw the power of it, an operant power that could touch planes miles apart, imposing its will on the physical world. He felt a chilling thought solidify in his mind. This isn't a meteorological event. This is a territorial one. The sky, their sky, was being claimed. The illusion of control shattered with a single panicked call from United 91. Mayday, mayday, mayday! We are in an uncontrolled descent. Cabin pressure dropping. The calm liturgy of the control room was broken by the shriek of alarms. Roman's screen showed the plane's icon plummeting, dropping 5,000 feet in under a minute. The pilot wasn't fighting turbulence. He was fighting for his life against a force that had no name. He was trying to escape, to select a new reality, where his plane was intact and his passengers were safe. But the sky wasn't letting him go. In that moment, for every controller listening, the abstract threat became terrifyingly real. It had teeth. I am that which they feared, a presence in the void. An emergency was declared, but it felt like a hollow gesture. How do you declare an emergency against the sky itself? You think science has all the answers. You assume that for every effect, there is a rational, observable cause. That assumption was the first casualty. As United 91 leveled out, scarred and terrified but blessedly intact, a new kind of team was scrambled. Not just engineers, but atmospheric scientists, biologists, people whose job it was to understand the very air we breathe. They sent weather, balloons into the affected corridors, their delicate instruments programmed to sample the void. The initial results were impossible. The readouts flickered with anomalies, trace elements that had no business being 35,000 feet in the air, rare earth metals, complex proteins, and something else, something that made the lead biologist go pale. Microscopic organisms, not bacteria caught in the jet stream, but complex, extremophilic life that looked less like it belonged on Earth and more like it belonged on the seafloor of a forgotten world. The sky was no longer empty. It was an ecosystem. But that's only the surface. The physical proof was undeniable. As the first of the affected aircraft were diverted and grounded for emergency inspections, the damage reports created a wave of disbelief. The windscreens, built to withstand bird strikes at 500 miles per hour, were covered in microscopic pitting, as if they'd been sandblasted with diamond dust. A strange, oily residue coated the leading edges of wings, a substance that was faintly acidic and corroded whatever it touched. Maintenance crews in hazmat suits scraped samples that sizzled faintly in their petri dishes. The consciousness of the engineers rebelled. This wasn't mechanical failure, it was biological assault. The pilots who spoke of a shimmer or a pressure were vindicated. They hadn't been imagining things. They had been flying through the digestive tract of something immeasurable. The new state was one of grim, terrifying validation. Here's what changes everything. The FAA, a bureaucracy built on caution and procedure, moved with a speed that felt like panic. First came the advisories, coded warnings to all air traffic about severe atmospheric anomalies, but the reports kept coming, faster now, more desperate. It was a cascade failure of the system. Within hours, the advisories became a mandate, an emergency ground stop for all aircraft above 25,000 feet. The language was cold, official. Atmospheric hazard of unknown origin. 3 words that did nothing to convey the sheer terror of the situation. An unknown origin. It meant they had no idea what it was, where it came from, or how to fight it. You could feel the operant power of this unseen enemy. It had forced the entire modern world to surrender its dominion over the skies. Humanity was being caged. Now go deeper. The meteorologists saw it next. On their advanced satellite imagery, they began to detect massive, cohesive pressure fluctuations. These were not weather fronts. Weather fronts move with the wind. They follow predictable patterns of temperature and pressure. These things moved against the wind. They demonstrated organized, non-random behavior. One moment, a vast area of anomalous pressure would be hovering over the Midwest. The next, it would seem to contract and surge towards the East Coast, as if drawn by a stimulus. The inner world of the command center became a chamber of horrors. Scientists pointing at screens, their voices hushed with dread. "It's hunting," one of them whispered, and nobody corrected him. The selection of what to believe was gone. You already are a subject of this new, impossible kingdom. The final chilling confirmation came from a military MQ-9 Reaper drone, scrambled from a silent, undisclosed base. Equipped with high-resolution optical sensors, it climbed past the 25,000-foot ceiling, entering the forbidden zone. For a few minutes, there was nothing but the cold, thin blue of the upper atmosphere. Then the camera feed distorted. The drone's operator saw the shimmer, the same warp in reality the pilots had described. And then he saw it. Not microorganisms, but a vast, undulating biological formation. A semi-translucent, filament-like structure miles across, pulsing with a faint internal light. It moved with a terrifying grace, a coordinated, flowing motion. The feeling is the key, and the feeling that shot through the command bunker was primal, absolute terror. This was not a hazard. It was an apex predator. The emergency directive came down like a guillotine. It was no longer just a warning for high altitudes. It was a final, absolute command from the FAA. All aircraft nationwide are to be grounded immediately. The words were stark, stripped of all bureaucracy. This was not a delay. It was a surrender. The sky was lost. At Metropolitan International, the reality of that surrender became a logistical nightmare. It was designated a primary emergency landing zone, a beacon for any flight still caught in the air. Plane after plane tore through the sky on desperate, final approaches, a frantic exodus from a hostile territory. The assumption of a routine landing, the simple act of touching tarmac and being safe, was now a prayer. Every pilot's voice on the radio was strained, their eyes scanning not just their instruments, but the darkening sky above. You already are in the fallout zone, the first wave of a war you didn't know had been declared. But that's only the surface. The scene on the ground at Metropolitan was controlled chaos. Every gate was filled, then every taxiway, then every spare inch of concrete. Jumbo jets were parked wing to wing with regional hoppers, a silent, grounded armada. The inner world of the ground crews and air traffic controllers was a frantic scramble, a high-stakes puzzle of metal and fuel and frightened people. Emergency services swarmed the tarmac, their flashing lights painting the grounded planes in strokes of red and blue. Then came the military. Humvees and heavy transport trucks rolled onto the airport grounds, establishing a perimeter. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about defense. The state of the airport had shifted from a civilian hub to a military staging area. The message was clear. Whatever was up there, it was now considered a matter of national security. Here's what changes everything. The satellite and drone feeds became the focus of a terrified, newly formed joint task force. The reconnaissance imagery was chilling. The massive biological formations were not just drifting. They were exhibiting clear, organized movement. Analysts, their voices low and strained, pointed out distinct patterns. The entities seemed to be establishing patrol routes, cordoning off huge sections of the atmosphere. They avoided each other, with a precision that suggested communication, a shared consciousness. They were behaving like a wolf pack circling a herd. And the herd was us. The strategists, men and women trained for conventional warfare, were forced to accept a new, terrifying reality. Their enemy was not human. It had no planes, no missiles, no borders. The enemy was the ecosystem itself, and it was intelligent. Now go deeper. The 25,000-foot ceiling proved to be a fragile, imaginary line. The creatures began to descend. An inbound flight from London, on its final approach to Metropolitan, was the first to make visual confirmation. The pilot's voice, broadcast over the tower's speakers for all to hear, was choked with awe and terror. "Tower, we have visual. My God, it's huge." He described a living shadow, a vast, dark shape that momentarily blotted out the afternoon sun, its underside shimmering with faint bioluminescent patterns. He spoke of translucent ribbon-like tendrils, miles long, that trailed beneath it, brushing the tops of the clouds. The selection of a safe reality was gone. The monster was no longer an abstraction on a radar screen. It was outside the window, a godlike being descending from the heavens. The final order was a whisper, a death sentence for the age of aviation. Air travel was suspended, indefinitely. The hum of jet engines that was the constant heartbeat of the modern world fell silent. At Metropolitan, the last engine spooled down, and an unnatural quiet fell over the airfield, broken only by the wind and the distant sirens. The feeling is the key, and the feeling was one of profound, suffocating helplessness. Humanity had been banished from the sky. As dusk fell, the people trapped in the terminal looked up, their faces pressed against the glass. They were looking for stars, but they saw only shadows. The siege was no longer in the sky. It was beginning on the ground. The threat was supposed to be in the sky. You assume safety on the solid ground beneath your feet. But the ground was the first thing to betray them. It began subtly. The lights in the main terminal at Metropolitan flickered, a momentary brownout. That sent a ripple of anxiety through the stranded crowds. On the tarmac, the engines of baggage carts and service vehicles sputtered and died, refusing to restart. A strange static bled through every radio frequency, a persistent, whispering hiss that felt organic, almost alive. This wasn't a secondary effect. It was a clear, calculated extension of the enemy's influence. The invisible tendrils of the things above were reaching down, testing the world below and finding it fragile. The very laws of physics felt like they were being rewritten, the basic assumption of cause and effect dissolving into chaos. But that's only the surface. Then came the darkness. The main power grid, already strained, suffered a catastrophic fluctuation and failed. The sprawling airport, a city unto itself, was plunged into a terrifying primitive blackness. A moment of collective held breath. Then the emergency generators kicked in with a guttural roar, casting long, dancing shadows across the concourses. The airport was now an island, running on finite power, its connection to the outside world severed. Communication systems degraded rapidly. Cell phone signals vanished. The internet went down. The inner world of every person trapped inside shrank to the space of the terminal, the tarmac, and the encroaching dark. They were cut off, adrift in a sea of encroaching silence and fear, their reality now defined by the hum of the generators and the whispers in the static. Here's what changes everything. As the evening storm clouds rolled in, bringing a low, oppressive ceiling, they saw them clearly for the first time. The children saw them first, their small hands pressing against the giant terminal windows pointing up. They weren't just vague shadows anymore. They were defined, horrifyingly organic formations, descending through the gray clouds like leviathans breaking the surface of the sea. Military observers on the roof, their faces grim, gave them a name: hunting formations. The term spread, like a virus through the ranks. The creatures moved with a slow, deliberate purpose, establishing vast circular patrol patterns directly over the airport infrastructure. The state of the survivors shifted in an instant. They were no longer just stranded travelers. They were the inhabitants of a terrarium, being watched by a patient, alien intelligence. Now go deeper. The creature's operant power was demonstrated with chilling precision. One of the smaller hunting formations, perhaps a mile in length, detached from the main group and descended, its shimmering underbelly passing just a few hundred feet over the main runway. As it moved, a visible wave of energy, like heat haze, washed over the ground below. A line of parked catering trucks and fuel tankers went dead. Their lights sparked and then extinguished. Their engines, even those not running, were fried, rendered, permanently inert. There was no explosion, no sound, just a silent, effortless neutralizing of technology. It wasn't a random energy field. It was targeted. It was a message, a display of absolute dominance. I am the power that can turn your world off. The final horrifying realization cemented itself in every mind. The airport was not a shelter. It was a cage. The military perimeter, which had seemed like a protective shield, now felt like the bars of a prison. All roads leading out of the airport were blocked by the same strange electrical failures. Cars stalled for miles. There was no escape. They were trapped on this island of concrete and glass, surrounded by an enemy that owned the sky and could kill with a silent, invisible touch. The feeling is the key, and the feeling that settled over Metropolitan International was not the frantic panic of a disaster, but the cold, quiet dread of a siege. They were surrounded, isolated, and being systematically dismantled by an intelligence they could not comprehend. Their only choice was to survive the night. You can't just wait to be devoured. The human spirit, even when caged, makes an assumption of its own. I am a survivor. That instinct, raw and powerful, took over Metropolitan International. Led by the airport's emergency director and a battle-hardened Air Force colonel, the survivors began to transform their prison into a fortress. They were surrounded by hundreds of hollow metal tubes, the grounded aircraft themselves. They became the new shelters. Crews worked feverishly, using service vehicles to haul baggage containers and cargo crates, creating barricades around clusters of planes. The luxury of a first-class seat became a cot in a makeshift barracks. The state of helplessness was rejected, replaced by a grim, defiant purpose. They would not be cattle. They would fight back. They would endure. But that's only the surface. Survival is a matter of mathematics. Food, water, medicine. The numbers were finite and terrifying. The airport, designed for the transient passage of thousands, was now a sealed city with a population it could not sustain. Rationing was implemented with military precision. Vending machines were emptied, restaurant kitchens stripped bare. Every bottle of water was counted. A makeshift hospital was set up in the main concourse, but medical supplies were critically low. The inner world of the community became a tense, fragile ecosystem. Fear and suspicion began to bubble beneath the surface of cooperation. A stolen box of granola bars, a hoarded case of antibiotics. These small acts became capital crimes. The enemy wasn't just in the sky anymore. It was in the hungry eyes of the person next to you. Here's what changes everything. The creatures adapted. They learned. Their patrol patterns, once predictable, became erratic and probing. They began systematic attacks, not with brute force, but with the same chilling precision as before. One of the hunting formations glided low over the control tower, and the complex web of radar and communication dishes on the roof simply melted. Not with heat, but with a targeted corrosive agent, a silvery mist that rained down and reduced advanced alloys to pitted slag. They targeted the ventilation shafts for the emergency generators, forcing the survivors to choose between breathable air and electrical power. The consciousness behind these attacks was undeniable. It was strategic. It was testing their defenses, identifying their most critical weaknesses, and dismantling them one by one. Now go deeper. Then came the pressure. It started as a low-grade headache, a sense of unease that settled over the entire airport. People became irritable, paranoid. The military's acoustic sensors, however, picked up what the human ear could not. A complex, organized pattern of ultrasonic frequencies. The creatures were communicating. They were broadcasting on a channel that resonated with the human brain, STEM, a signal that bypassed logic and went straight for the primal centers of fear and anxiety. The siege became psychological. The operant power of the entities was insidious, turning the survivors' own minds against them. They weren't just being held captive. They were being mentally tenderized, marinated in a frequency of pure dread. The breaking point came with a silent flash, followed by a concussive roar that shook the very foundations of the terminal. The creatures, in their relentless probing, had finally found the most vulnerable point, the main fuel depot. A single, shimmering tendril descended from the clouds and brushed against one of the massive storage tanks. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. It lit up the night sky, a funeral pyre for their dwindling hope. The blast incinerated a dozen of the aircraft they had converted into shelters. The precious fuel reserves, their lifeblood for power and heat, were gone. The feeling is the key, and as the survivors stared at the inferno, the feeling was one of utter despair. They were cornered, exhausted, and now they were running out of time. A new selection had to be made. Find a way to kill them or die. Despair is a quiet poison. In the aftermath of the fuel depot explosion, a heavy, suffocating silence settled over the survivors at Metropolitan. Hope had been burned away, leaving only the cold ash of inevitability. But you must make the assumption that even in the darkest room, a single mind can be a candle. That mind belonged to Dr. Eris Thorne, a radio astronomer who had been on her way to a conference. While others saw an unstoppable force, Thorne's consciousness saw only a biological system. And all systems, she knew, have rules. All systems have weaknesses, Surrounded by salvaged equipment and a makeshift lab in the baggage claim area, she ignored the encroaching dread and focused on the data. The static, the ultrasonic chatter, the faint energy signatures the creatures left in their wake. Her inner world was one of patterns, not panic. But that's only the surface. The breakthrough came not with a shout, but a flicker on a screen. Thorne was analyzing the recordings of the creature's energy fields, specifically how they reacted to the airport's environment. She noticed a recurring, almost imperceptible anomaly. Every 12 seconds, the energy signature of the nearest hunting formation would flinch. It was a microsecond of instability, a momentary disruption in its otherwise smooth, terrifying power. She cross-referenced the timing. 12 seconds, the exact rotation speed of Metropolitan's primary search radar. The powerful, sweeping beam, still mindlessly scanning the empty skies, was brushing against the creature. And the creature, on some fundamental level, was reacting to it. It was the first sign of a vulnerability, the first proof that these gods could be touched. Here's what changes everything. The hypothesis formed in her mind with the force of a revelation. It wasn't just the radar beam, it was the frequency. The creatures, biological in nature, were highly sensitive to a specific band of microwave radiation. Their own energy fields, their communication, their very cellular structure was being disrupted by it. She checked the specifications of the ASR-11 radar system. It operated between 2.7 and 3.2 gigahertz. It was the perfect frequency. They weren't just sitting in a cage. They were sitting inside a potential weapon of unimaginable power. The state of the game changed. A desperate, electrifying hope began to push back against the despair. The key wasn't to hide from the creatures. It was to scream at them in a language they couldn't ignore. Now go deeper. Thorne, along with the airport's chief engineer and the Air Force colonel, formulated a plan that was equal parts brilliance and insanity. Operation Clear Sky. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They would modify the primary radar, disabling its rotational motor and overriding every safety protocol to focus its output into a single, concentrated, continuous beam, a directed energy weapon. To generate a pulse strong enough to be lethal, they would need to channel every last watt of power from the dwindling emergency generators. The lights would go out. The makeshift hospital would lose power. Everything would be sacrificed for one all-or-nothing shot. The selection was made. It was a Hail Mary, a final defiant act against the silent circling gods. The work began. Engineers, their faces lit by flashlights and the glow of laptops, worked feverishly to hotwire the radar's core systems. Soldiers fortified the base of the radar tower, preparing for a last stand. Thorne, meanwhile, analyzed the creature's patrol patterns, predicting their behavior. She identified a convergence point, a time just before dawn, when the largest hunting formations would gather. Directly over the central terminal, a moment of maximum exposure, a perfect kill box, a tense electric energy filled the air. The feeling is the key, and the feeling was no longer fear. It was the cold, sharp, adrenaline-fueled focus of the hunter. They had one shot to take back, their sky. The final assumption is faith. Faith in a desperate plan, in a single mind, in the cold logic of physics. As the countdown began, the emergency generators sputtered and died, rerouted to a single purpose. Metropolitan International was plunged into an absolute, suffocating darkness. The collective breath of thousands was held in the black. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind across the tarmac and a deep rising hum from the radar tower as its capacitors charged to a critical state. In the makeshift shelters, in the darkened concourses, people held each other close. It was a shared moment of silent prayer, a final gamble. They had chosen to fight, and now they would face the consequences. I am the silence before the storm. The final moment of stillness before a new reality is born. The colonel's voice over the radio was the only sound. Execute. A single keystroke, and 47 seconds of stored, concentrated power erupted from the radar dish. There was no sound, no explosion, just a beam of pure, invisible energy, a silent spear hurled into the heart of the leviathans above. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the sky ignited. A wave of sickly, emerald-green light pulsed outwards. From a point directly overhead, the bioluminescence of the creatures flaring in a silent, agonizing scream. The vast, interconnected forms began to convulse, then to fray, dissolving like tissue paper in a fire. Great, shimmering sheets of them broke apart and rained down, not as solid matter, but as a fine, corrosive dust that sizzled into nothing before it reached the ground. The gods were dying. The beam cut out. The eerie green light faded, leaving behind an impossible sight. Stars, a clear black star-filled sky. For the first time in days, the oppressive ceiling was gone. A stunned silence gripped the airport, a silence of disbelief and awe. Then, a single shout. It was followed by another, and another, until a raw, cathartic roar erupted from the survivors. They had done it. They had faced the impossible and won. The state of fear was broken, shattered by a wave of triumphant relief. They had taken back their sky. But as the engineers brought the auxiliary power back online, a single screen in the control room blinked to life. The long-range sensors showed a new anomaly. A secondary population, just as large as the first, was approaching from the east. The celebration died in their throats, but the new wave stopped. It halted at a precise, invisible boundary, miles away from the airport. The creatures seemed to pause, to observe the now empty airspace where their brethren had just been annihilated. On the screens, the survivors watched as the massive biological formation seemed to deliberate. It was an intelligence capable of learning, of recognizing a threat. It had witnessed the demonstration. It understood that this small pocket of the world was no longer defenseless prey. After a long, tense moment, the formation slowly, deliberately, changed course. It retreated. The operant power had shifted. The airport was no longer a cage. It was a fortress, and its weapon was awake. In the dawnlight, the first military helicopters arrived, their rotors beating a thunderous welcome rhythm. The siege of Metropolitan International was over, but the world had changed forever. The airport never reopened to civilians. It became Joint Base Metropolitan, a heavily fortified atmospheric monitoring station. Its weaponized radar now a permanent guardian, the centerpiece of a new kind of global defense. The feeling is the key, and the feeling that remained was not one of victory, but of a grim, unending vigilance. Humanity had survived, but it now knew it was not alone. You already are living in a new age, an age where you understand that the vast empty sky is a lie, and that you must forever watch for the shadows that move within it. You weren't meant to just survive the story. You were meant to understand the warning. The silence in the sky is not peace. It is a ceasefire. So, now that you know what's really up there, what are you going to do the next time a shadow passes over you on a perfectly sunny day? Leave your answer below and subscribe. The next broadcast will teach you what to listen for when the silence breaks.